This lecture will focus on a very important topic, the origins of slavery in America. An overview of slavery in America. In 1619, the first ship carrying slaves arrived in the colonies. This was a Dutch slave ship. Slavery would become embedded within society both economically and socially. Slavery was eliminated in 1863 with the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation, and formally with the 13th Amendment. However, segregation would exist in America until the 1970s. The start. Slavery existed in Africa prior to the start of the European slave trade. Islamic slave traders from North Africa often bought slaves from non-Islamic Africa. The Portuguese were the first to get involved with the African slave trade starting in the 15th century, followed by the Dutch and the English. The journey of a slave. This next section of the lecture will focus on the capture, the voyage, the sale, and the new life of those who were enslaved. The capture. Most often, fellow Africans cooperated with European slave traders. Slaves were often war captives, undesirables, or simply handed over for profit and reward. Europeans would build trading posts along the West African coast where slaves would be brought until being shipped to the Americas or Europe. The voyage of a slave across the Atlantic was absolutely horrible. There were two common ways to pack slaves, tight pack and loose pack. With tight pack, slaves were chained together lying down on their sides. The loose pack method placed slaves on their backs while chained together. As a result of these inhumane conditions, 20% of slaves died on the journey. Over the course of the slave trade, 10 to 12 million human beings would be transported to the Americas. This would greatly alter the societies of West Africa. It is interesting to note that most slaves were brought to the Caribbean and South America. Triangular trade. This refers to the trade routes between the Americas, Europe, and Africa. Slaves were sent to the Americas, natural resources were sent from America to Europe, and finished goods and rum were sent from Europe to Africa and the Americas. Essentially, human beings were simply seen as a product that could be bought and sold. The sale. Those slaves who did survive the journey would be auctioned off like animal livestock. Plantation owners would bid on the slaves and inspect them like animals looking for size, condition of teeth, age, etc. Women and children were sold for less. Once purchased, the slaves would be chained and brought to their new homes. Their lives and culture would never be the same again. Their new life. New slaves would not know the new language or customs. Slaves would live in shacks on the plantation and would work in the fields harvesting tobacco, cotton, and other crops like indigo. An overseer, usually white, would whip those who did not work hard enough. This next section of the lecture focuses on slavery in the colonies. We will learn about how slavery became embedded in the South, the treatment of slaves, the task system, and resistance. The South. Slavery originally existed in all the colonies. However, most slaves brought to the colonies were used in the South. The South was agrarian, meaning that they had an agriculturally based economy. The crops that they produced were very labor-intensive. They preferred slaves to English indentured servants because slaves had no legal rights. Although most slaves originally went to the Caribbean and South America, over time the population of slaves in the South increased significantly due to natural increase. It became commonplace for slave owners to sell slave children for profit. Their treatment. Slaves had no legal rights and could be beaten or killed if the owner so desired. In the southern colonies, slaves were allowed to marry and have children, while in the Caribbean it was cheaper for the owner to work the slave to death and buy another. Slave families could be separated at any time. The task system. In order to reduce the chance of resistance, some owners introduced the task system. Slaves had to complete a quota of work each day. Once finished, they could grow and harvest their own crops on a small plot of land. This was actually a manipulative tactic used by plantation owners to prevent slaves from running away and resisting. Resistance. Abolitionists were those who opposed slavery. Slave resistance was more common in the Caribbean because of how horrible conditions were on the sugar plantations. Resistance in the southern colonies was less due to the threat of family separation. However, resistance did still exist, but was often unsuccessful. Some common ways to resist was through slow work, stealing, sabotage, and running away. Nat Turner, a slave, organized an uprising. Slaves rose up on neighboring plantations and killed their owners. Eventually the uprising was suppressed. The heads of the slaves were placed on spikes along a roadway as a reminder to other slaves not to resist. Conclusions. Slavery became completely entrenched within American society, especially the Southern economy. Although opposition movements existed, it literally took several hundred years to abolish slavery. The existence of slavery shows how the human mind can sometimes be manipulated and distorted to believe in a horrible thing. This topic also reveals the depravity of the human heart and our collective need for a savior. For more information on this topic, log on to YouTube and watch the episode Crash Course: The Atlantic Slave Trade.